Hello and welcome. I'm Claudia Rizzini, the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to introduce our Francis B. Cashin Fellow Rob Verchick. Grappling with the climate is not a fad like sous vide cooking or axe throwing, Rob would tell you. It is the new normal. Over the last 2 decades, Rob has been one of the most prominent voices in disaster and climate change law. As a member of the EPA during the Obama administration and as current president of the Center for Progressive Reform, he has shaped the discourse on climate change adaptation and climate resilience for our generation. Critically, his work bridges the gap between scientific experts, government officials, and the general public. Whether diving to see a coral restoration nursery off the coast of Florida or paddling through Louisiana Bayou, Rob takes a hands-on approach, learning from researchers and conservationists and passing on their efforts to the public. Rob's more recent book, The Octopus in the Parking Garage, aimed to educate and engage non-experts on climate resilience by giving readers a tour around the globe of efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change on our planet. On his podcast, Connect the Dots, Rob's interviews with legal scholars, activists, and researchers amplify the small and not so small policy wins and scientific breakthrough happening in the world today. During his time at Radcliffe, Rob is working on Nemo's Fever, another book for the general audience about how we can harness the power of government, science, and the local wisdom to rescue the oceans from climate breakdown. He hopes that the book will empower readers to face the climate crisis and show what we can all do to adapt and thrive. The Q&A part of the talk today will be moderated by George Sarinicolau, the Executive Director of the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard University. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Rob Verchick to the podium.
Hello, everybody. It's good to see you. As we start, I want to ask you to do something with me. I want you to take 2 deep breaths. Okay, we're going to do it together. All right. One of those breaths came from the ocean. Today, I'm going to tell you about all of the great things that the ocean does for us, and we don't even know it. And I'm going to tell you about the trouble that it's in on account of climate breakdown. And then I'm going to show what we might be able to do about it if we keep our focus and if we remember to breathe. I am not the most obvious advocate of ocean protection, okay? So I was born in Las Vegas in the Mojave Desert, and I'm a lawyer, all right? And, but the one thing that I do know about over the years that I've worked really hard on is learning about legal policies and governmental policies about adapting to climate change. And I do have a book out about that. And when I was writing one of the last chapters of that book, I got really fascinated about coral, particularly coral in the Caribbean and then along the coast of Florida. And I learned a lot about adaptation and coral restoration from people like Cara Norman, a high school student that I interviewed, who showed me all kinds of things about how coral works and how it might be restored. And so I started thinking, oh my gosh, there's a whole ocean out there that needs adaptation to climate change. And so while I was still writing the book, toward the very end, I went on a sabbatical. And I went to a little island called Moorea in French Polynesia. It was a hardship position. And And while I was there and writing and thinking deep thoughts, I did things that other people do there too. I did my snorkeling, I looked at fish, and I was fascinated again by this particular fish. All right, now this is an anemone fish, and it lives with a little animal called an anemone. And you may know that fish as a clownfish, or maybe you've seen it in Finding Nemo. I didn't know much about that fish except for the movie. I did know about an anemone because they're related to coral, and I had been studying that. And I knew that anemones had a really hard time living in waters that are getting warmer. And I wondered if maybe the fish that I thought was so cute was also having a similar problem. So as one does, I went to the neighborhood marine station. There are actually 2 marine stations on Moorea, which is one of the wonderful parts of being on that island. And I met this great professor and marine scientist named Susie Mills. And she has all of these tanks of water and fish in them. And if you look really carefully, they're little tiny Nemos flying around. And they go from one tank to the other because one tank is cooler and one is warmer, and she watches where they like to go. And then she tests their breath, their respiration, and she tests their stress levels. And I said, "Why are you doing all of this, Susie?" And she says, "Well, I'm trying to see if I might be able to identify certain individuals that are more robust in different kinds of temperatures of the water, because this water is too warm and it's not going to cool down anytime soon. We could turn all the lights off and not use fossil fuel again, and in our lifetime, that ocean would not get cooler. It's a big, hot water bottle." And that got me to thinking that everything is too warm. If you or I had more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit added to our temperature right now, we'd be in the doctor's office. And so what do we do about the rest of the ocean? I started to think about this. And what I came out with was this idea about feeding a fever that we hear about, right? If you can't cool the patient down, what you do is you give it nourishment and space to recover, to rest. And that's really what climate adaptation is mostly about, is taking away the stressors that you can control because you've got other stressors that you can't control. And so the other thing then I started to think about is if we're going to do this globally, we have to have another way of imagining what the world and the ocean is like from a cultural and from a legal perspective. Now, have we done that before? Yes. You've seen this picture, right? The blue marble picture. It's everywhere, and it changed the way people all over the world think about their home. They sometimes see it as, we can say, spaceship Earth, right? Well, here is the flip side of that you might not have ever seen before. That's spaceship water. And it's hard to even find land in this picture. There's Baja California's over there. And what this illustrates, I think, is how lucky we are to be on a planet that is covered mostly in salt water. It does so many things for us that we don't even have to think about. It provides 1 out of every 2 breaths that you take because of that microscopic plankton and kelp and other things that are creating oxygen. It feeds the world, sometimes for free, if you can manage to get out in a boat and pull fish out of the water. It has, for thousands of years, managed the currents for seafaring societies. And it controls the weather and the climates that we're feeling right now. The other thing it does is it holds in that big water bottle, it holds 90% of all of the heat that we end up trapping in the atmosphere with carbon pollution, right? If that were in the atmosphere, we'd be in big trouble. So it's doing a lot of good things for us. And it's no exaggeration to say no blue, no green. Now, I didn't make that phrase up. That phrase belongs to Sylvia Earle, who some of you may have heard of. She is one of the most celebrated marine scientists in history. She grew up in New Jersey and then later moved as a child to the Gulf Coast, off the coast of Florida. She is one of the groundbreaking marine scientists. She's an engineer who designs submarines. She's a pioneer. She has walked on the floor of the ocean over 1,200 feet below the surface. And she's a former Radcliffe Fellow. From 1968 to 1969. They called them Bunting Fellows then, and all her work from that time is in the Schlesinger Library right here, and I have some researchers who've been trying to get a hold of that. She has advised many lawmakers. She's advised many politicians over the years. I had the deep pleasure for a week to be able to visit with her on Moorea when I was there. And I learned a tremendous amount. One of the things I learned was never, ever, ever give up. And the other thing that I learned from her is that science is just the very beginning of a journey that ends up with evolutions in law, economics, and culture. And she has spent most of her time in the last 20, 30 years talking to people about those last three things that I just mentioned. The other thing is she knows that the ocean's on the ropes because of climate change. So we've got way too much heat in the ocean, and we have lost a half of all coral in the last 70 years. All right? There's an acidification in the ocean because that CO2 is also stored in the ocean, and it takes away the carbonate ions that all these little animals use to build shells and things, right? We know about sea level rise. There are millions of people whose lives depend on being protected from the parameters of the ocean. So we've got those things: heat, acidification, sea level rise, all related to climate breakdown. None of those things we can change in any responsible way. So what do? We have to look at the other side of the equation, the things we've been doing a long time that have caused stress, things like pollution, things like overfishing, drilling and mining, and these kinds of things. That has to be where we look. Now, there's another part of this equation. We have a water planet. We also have a law planet. We have a whole cultural system of relating to this water. And in our system, even under international law, it goes all the way back to this water-based idea of a legal scholar, a theorist named Hugo Grotius from the Netherlands. And this comes from a particular time, a time of European colonialism. And Grotius worked for the government in the Netherlands, and one of the things he was trying to do was to develop a theory that would promote Dutch imperialism. And so he created this idea, right, called mare liberum, which means the free sea, the free ocean. And the basic idea was that most of that water out there you could cross and do whatever you wanted with. You could take things out of it, and it was your property if you could hold on to it, right, including maybe the countries, the other peoples that you were getting to through your navigation, right? And we've inherited that system, and it is still the foundation of international law in the world, all right? Now, there are some things that follow from that. One idea from the very beginning of that was that the ocean was something very foreign and very unknown. It's not where we really belonged. It was an adventure project or a scary project. The second thing that came out of that was that our imagination around the ocean was very shallow. We only thought about the things that we could immediately use or see. And as a result, even our laws got extremely fragmented. We've got hundreds of treaties about the ocean, but they're about migratory birds, they're about seals, they're about turtles, they're about pollock. There are very few that put everything together and think about this as a holistic system. I counted the other day, we have over 25 US federal agencies that have something to do with protecting the ocean, right? So the last part of this is that our concept is a very fixed concept. We imagine that the ocean just stays the same way. Everything in it does the same thing, like it's always been, the temperature's the same, the whole thing, right? And one thing that you should do, if you haven't already, and springtime is coming up, you should go whale watching in Stellwagen Bank Marine Sanctuary. There's a picture right there where you end up going. That's one of the best places in North America to see humpback whales. A beautiful feeding ground for them. It's in a national sanctuary that was created by Congress in 1992, and it protects those whales from navigation, getting hit by boats, loud noise, all that kind of stuff, all right? But here's what I want to tell you. Everyone I talk to who knows about these whales says that in 20, 30 years, they're going to be further north because the water's going to be too warm. And you know where that sanctuary is going to be? The same place. It's going to be right where it is now because it's fixed. And so these are the sorts of things that we can start thinking about. We have inherited a system that's foreign, that's shallow, that's fixed. What we need is a system that's engaging, that is deep, meaning it thinks about the entire function of a system, and that is dynamic, that changes as we learn more and observe more about what's going on. Some of that we might learn in a place like French Polynesia. Now, part of the imagination is what I find is the most exciting part, but it's a really, really hard part, right? And it's related to something when Melanie McAllister was talking about sort of past ideas about what the future would look like, right? We have to try to imagine what our future could look like, all right? And we have to start looking for ways that we might be able to build it. So I feel like an eagle flying over a tide flat looking for scraps of fish, right? You know, just anything that'll work that might bring some value. And so my researchers and I, we've been looking at different kinds of ideas that we think might be able to apply in this new kind of imaginative system that we're talking about. One is this idea about protecting special places, underwater parks. We have them, I'll talk to you more about them, we need more, all right? The other is this idea about respecting nature's rights. And I see this as a very broad system. And what I mean is anything, I want to move from anything that looks at resources as property and look at a system that sees resources as some kind of other protected entity in need of some kind of stewardship or guardianship. For lawyers, when we talk about like what your remedies are, we think about, for property, the remedy's cash and compensation to the owner. But if we're talking about another kind of entity, we might be talking about reparations, ways to repair something that's been damaged, as opposed to compensating the owner. And engaging the community is always a good idea, right? Always a way of getting people excited and invested in something that's happening. Now, luckily, the law of the sea, which is based on Hugo Grotius, is not all bad, right? There's a lot of good stuff in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. One of the things, this is the longest law we're going to learn today, right, is that there are these high seas, but countries today have the right to manage their waters within, essentially 200 nautical miles from the shore. Now, they can exploit it. You've seen that up there on the slide. But they can also conserve it if they want to. And sometimes there might be legal duties to do that. So if you take a look at that map that Hugo Grotius envisioned, there are huge pieces now of coastal land that are under, and waters off the coast, that are under the jurisdiction of individual countries, sometimes shared, but that's easier, right? Now, if you're worried about the high seas, and I'm worried about the high seas because it's like the Wild West out there, just last year, under the UN auspices, nations agreed to a treaty that really hasn't been, that really hasn't been promoted much in the news. We can colloquially call it the High Seas Treaty. And essentially what it does, for the first time, it agrees on ways that we might be able to manage and maintain protective underwater parks on the high seas, and also ways that we might be able to envision environmental impacts as something besides the loss of cash, right? To talk about restoration value. So those things are all really promising. That's good news too. What might we do if we were concerned about one thing? Animal called coral, right? One of my favorite new animal, all right? How might this look if we were to take some of these things and apply them to coral? Coral is an amazing animal, right? And if you didn't know it was an animal, it's okay. Aristotle didn't know either, all right? He called it a rock-like vegetable, right? But anyway, it's great. It's a big mouth, it's got tentacles, it's got a little tiny stomach. But what's really cool about these coral, right, is that they have algae, a plant-like animal, or a plant-like entity living within it that photosynthesizes and feeds it when it doesn't catch enough food, right? That's that symbiotic relationship. And these critters are everywhere, and we've got something like 1,800 coral reefs in 41 countries around the world. You could not make this up. I know it because I've been to the New England Aquarium, which has wonderful reef fish exhibits. But I'm here to tell you, if you go to one of the tanks, and they're beautiful tanks, and I love the aquarium, it's fake coral. And I asked, I said, why is it fake coral? It's made out of fiberglass. And they said, well, we can't bring, 500-year-old coral in here in this space at this scale and maintain it. So there's a lady there vacuuming the coral, right? Because the fish don't clean it because there's nothing to eat. And I love that aquarium. And I was there last time in the fall. And there's this little girl with her mother. And the little girl's like, why is that lady vacuuming the coral? and I love it. I mean, it's a discussion, right, that you can have, that this is something so amazing, this animal, that it has to live in the wild. I mean, some people have little aquariums and things, but if you're gonna do it, it's a super sophisticated system. So despite all that, only 1% of the ocean floor has coral on it. And guess what? It supports 25% of all the life in the ocean. All right? There are some studies that say we might not have coral by the end of the century if we don't get our act together with climate breakdown. So think about that. All right? Food and medicine for millions of people. These reefs buffer huge populations from storms. And they're really, really effective at it. The engineers can't build anything better than that. In fact, we think almost $4 trillion of benefits accrue because of coral every single year. It's a free service. Now, one of the things that we have to reckon with is we haven't been very good stewards of coral. 15% of the coral, 15, have died in the last 12 years. Okay, that's fast. Why? Well, because we have a lot of pollution coming from islands and from our coasts, and even from Tahiti and some of the other Polynesian islands. There's a lot of overfishing and drilling, and we've got that heat, that acidification, and the rising seas, which takes the coral away from the sunlight, if you think about it that way, which makes it a little harder, right? And so way back when, what I teach my students is the first animal in the United States that was listed under the Endangered Species Act because of climate change was coral, right? And we haven't been able to do much in the United States yet to really help. One of the problems is that the Endangered Species Act actually creates a lot of bureaucracy for moving certain kinds of coral around, right? Even though we might need to in order to replace coral. And so that creates that catch-22. We don't want to intervene because we feel guilty, but we've intervened so much that we have to do something, right? And so that's a really hard problem that people are dealing with. But that's what coral bleaching looks like. What is coral bleaching? It's just those little tiny algae, right, that are creating the food that the coral is eating. Those little tiny algae get too warm, they get sick, and then the coral spit them out. So then there's no more colorful algae. They turn white, and they starve. So how do we fix a problem like that? One of the ways is to feed the fever. There's good science that says, and some of this science comes right out of French Polynesia, that if you have otherwise healthy coral reefs, they have the power to rebound themselves, but not if you dump all those other things on top of them while they're trying to do it. The other thing that we see was we could use some of those underwater parks to help, right? We do have protected places. The problem is only 3% of them are protective enough to actually keep the biological functioning going, right? We're like BLM land, where you can mine it, you can chop the trees down, and you can hike, and you can use it for habitat. You can't do all of those things at once, right? And so this multiple use idea is a hard problem for that. There is a movement to say, let's protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. And it's credible, there are real people involved. You know who's involved? Sylvia Earle, one of the most prominent advocates for the 30 by 30 system. The other thing, and this is just to go to show there's plenty of scientific evidence showing you that there are corals that could be saved in particular places that are really important from a biological point of view. And guess what? Almost all of them are in jurisdictional waters, right? So you don't even have to deal with the high seas. Why? Because coral, because they need that sunlight, they like to be shallow, relatively speaking. Right? So that keeps them close to coast, and that helps them protect coast. So all of these things are kind of fitting together, as you can see. And as it turns out, one of those places where coral would really benefit from some protection is in the South Pacific. Now, I talked a little bit about respecting nature's rights, and although that might mean making a river a person or a forest a person in a legal sense, it can mean something more expansive. So we don't even have to get, I don't think, into the philosophical argument about that. What we can do is think, though, about those other things I talked about in terms of property versus stewardship. Now, Belize is highly dependent on that Mesoamerican coral reef, which is the second largest in the world outside the barrier reef. And when a ship went aground on that coral and broke it apart, Belize took them to court. The first thing they thought about, the lawyers, was, oh, we'll say we own the reef and we'll get money damages. But then they amended their complaint. And instead they said, no, that coral reef is a legal entity and the Belize government is the steward of it. And the damages shot up to several millions of dollars, which allowed them then to replace parts of the reef and put parts of it back together. So that's a nature's rights story. Here's another one, also related to that very same reef, only this time in the Yucatan Peninsula. So if you've been to Cancun, if you've been to Quintana Roo or some of the other states in Mexico, you might have seen all the tourists who love those reefs, right? And they break apart during storms, unfortunately. Now, for the first time a few years ago, there's an insurance policy, a health insurance policy for a living ecosystem, sponsored by Swiss Re. And what happens is when a storm breaks that apart, money is released to certain states and to certain actors, and then volunteers and others are paid to assemble that reef and put it back together. It works. It worked after Hurricane Delta, and it's worked after other storms, and now Hawaii has the same thing. This time with Munich Re, a reinsurance company that's interested in these products. This is a kind of legal entity that now has an insurance policy connected to it. So you can do these kinds of things. Looking in the South Pacific, is sort of really interesting for reasons I can talk about. That's Tetiaroa. That's a hope spot. That's what Sylvia Earle calls them. It's a protected sanctuary. It's also the island that Marlon Brando used to own, right? And his estate actually still owns that island. But this is not, that old idea about something far away and unknowable that we're going to have adventure about, right? This particular sanctuary is populated by community members who care about it and who go and they learn about it, and they take part in surveying, observing, and deciding how best to protect that particular park. As it turns out, Polynesia is a wonderful place to look at for a new way of thinking. Anthropologists who've looked at historically seafaring countries or seafaring peoples see the Polynesian system as different from almost anywhere else in the world historically, different from the Mediterranean, the North Atlantic, different from the Indian Ocean. In Polynesia, there was a system and an understanding that was much more deeply engaged, where the ecosystems themselves, although they didn't call it that, were seen as entities that needed protecting, and where dynamism happened. I mean, they actually had, in Moorea and other places, they actually had what we would now call underwater parks that moved around depending upon where the fish were and how things worked. I learned a lot about this from a friend now, a guy named Tituan Bernico, who's an islander. He grew up on a little tiny island, so small it didn't have a school. He had to take a boat to go to school every day. He eventually moved to Moorea. Like most kids who grew up there, he grew up surfing, he grew up deep sea, or rather free diving. He grew up spear fishing, something I tried to no avail. And he knew everything about the ocean. He knew every single fish by name when he was a little kid. But he didn't know anything about coral. And so one day, he was 16 years old, as he tells the story. He found a piece of white coral and wondered what was wrong with it. And he found out. He sort of did that research about bleached coral. And so what did he do? Well, he started learning about how you might be able to protect coral through some of the ways that we talked. And now he has one of the most well-known coral restoration projects in the world. And it's very different from other coral restoration projects that I have visited. It's called Coral Gardeners. There they are. Some of them are free diving. Some of them have tanks, but often they don't because the water's shallow enough that can bob up and down and grow all kinds of different corals and replace them when needed. But look at this. This is not your grandmother's coral restoration project, right? It is completely online. They have, their social media feed is by far the most popular social media feed in all of French Polynesia. Period. All right? And they're telling, they're cracking jokes. They're bringing in, when I went to visit, there were young adults from every corner of the globe who've flown in just to volunteer, just to work, just to do all kinds of things like this. They have this Adopt a Coral program. For $50, you adopt a coral. This is charismatic coral. All right, you see it, and you're like, "Oh my God, it's so cute!" And then they tell you about it, and they say, "Oh, and it protects the shore from tides and these kinds of things." And they have ensorcelled investors in Silicon Valley and the rest of the United States. They've got a budget of over $5 million a year now. They've got engineers and others from MIT and Cal and Stanford going down there working with island kids to build new kinds of machines and robots. All right? And, they want to move on out. So they've moved on through different parts of French Polynesia. They're in Fiji. There are lots of these coral restoration projects around the world. And they're getting attention from people like Sylvia Earle. I was on Moorea when they met. Wonderful story, right? Because she wants to see these things succeed. And she knows this is what the future is like and how you change imagination. Now, there are other things that are going to be in my book, and I'm not going to tell you about them, other than to say I'm really fascinated by the Salish Sea, where I spend some time in Washington State during the summer, and the Lummi Indians, and some of the tribes, and also some of the most studied whales in the world are in the Salish Sea. And there's a whole effort to create legal entity rights for either the orcas or for the Salish Sea itself. I'm really interested, fascinated by the Gloucester Fishermen Wives Association, which does all kinds of good work in the fisheries here in Massachusetts. All of their papers are in the Schlesinger Library. It's a treasure trove, and this week I've commanded my researchers to go through and find out what it is that we want to find from there and what we can learn. I've spent time in the Sundarban Islands off the coast of Kolkata in India, and am fascinated by how they are attempting to stitch their coastlines together, even as there are wild tigers living on nearby islands. And so I want to write about that. What I do know is personalities matter and individuals matter if you're going to tell a story and if you're going to change people's imagination. And the other thing I know is that it takes a big research team who are really committed to this kind of work. And I've got folks, my research partners here at Harvard, who are here today, and also my researchers, my legal researchers at Loyola have been just wonderful about all of this. The one thing that I want to ask you to do is to take the plunge with me. I want you to think about whatever it is that the ocean gives to you and how you might be able to give back in some way, even a small way. It's a good thing. All you have to do is stay focused and remember to breathe.
Thank you, Rob, and welcome
Thank
back
you.
to Harvard.
Well, thank you.
Great to have you here, and thank you for this thought-provoking talk. My job here is to ask you some questions. So I'm going to ask you with a bit of a downer, because that's just my personality, so forgive me. I'll try to balance your optimism here a little bit. So my question to you, as someone who has spent more than 20 years working on sustainability and in climate, is to what extent can we adapt to protect the oceans as you envision, given the climate impacts that are predicted? Acidification, warming, sea level rise.
We cannot protect all of the ocean and all of the ecosystems and all of the things that the ocean does. I'm not a scientist. I talk to a lot of scientists. And I am convinced that we can protect parts of it in ways that are significant, both in terms of significant for human populations and significant for the wider non-human community. I don't think, and I tell my students this all the time, I mean, you're right, we're in this terrible situation with a lot of urgency, I'm trying to talk about changing the culture. That takes a long time, right? And we don't have a long time. And so I completely understand all of that. What I try to tell my students, and what I would tell everybody here, is that climate change is not a pass-fail exam, right? Just because you can't get an A doesn't mean you settle for an F. What you do is you pick something and you work on it and you try to make it as good as you can. Can we protect certain peoples in certain coastal communities that might otherwise lose their land? Yeah, we can do that. We can protect millions of people in the globe by doing those sorts of things. Can we use the ocean to generate food, maybe in terms of plant life, that would provide free and accessible protein to millions of people who otherwise can't afford food? Yes, we can do that. We can't save everything. I wish we could, but that doesn't mean you give up.
Before I ask you the next question, let me just remind everyone that if you would like to submit questions to Rob Verchick, please use this QR code on the side of the room. Let's talk about this nature's rights strategy. Nature seems to be losing, but there are, as you say, there's potential and there are real-life examples. Can you unpack what a nature strategy would be and how it would work?
Yeah, and I want to say that I started very skeptical of the nature's right idea because I had a somewhat narrow view of it. My narrow view was that it was essentially trying to convince a court or trying to convince a lawmaking body to say that there was an ecosystem of some kind, whether it's a river or an ocean or a forest, and say it had personhood and that there was some kind of a guardianship attached to it. And the reason I was skeptical of that, one is I thought that that was impractical, and two is I thought, well, you're still going to have human beings trying to make standards to protect something, and that's what we have now, and it doesn't work, right? And so I thought, okay, so what do you get out of it? And there's a lot of literature, legal literature on this, but I think here's what you do get. First of all, it changes the focus on looking at the damages of a whole functioning ecosystem and trying to restore it. Now, we have things like that in the United States, for instance, that we don't call nature's rights, okay? So after the Deepwater Horizon blowout, the BP blowout, there was tremendous damage on the coast and in the marshland. And under some legislation, the Oil Pollution Act, states are entitled, and Indian tribes too, to sue for what's called natural resource damage. And that's a particular term of art that means money to actually restore to restore the thing that was lost, as opposed to just the damages. And as a result, in Louisiana, we have the world's largest coastal restoration project that's now funded to about $10 billion. Most of that money is coming from sources like that. Now, I never thought of that as nature's rights. But the law firms who do nature's rights work think of that as nature's rights. And I don't care what you call it, right? But I do think what's interesting about it is to be able to, we now have the science that shows us how these things function and their connection to people. That's the first part of getting to nature's rights. And then the second part is we now have a much more amplified voice of cultural populations for which this is a very resonant idea. In the Salish Sea, which is Puget Sound and the waters above it, the interior waters in Canada and Washington, there are lots of tribal groups that actually find that as a very resonant principle. And so they back legislation that help them achieve those ends. Same thing happened in New Zealand, where we have a movement there. The Maori are very interested in these legal ideas that connect. Now, is it the best way or not the best way? I don't know, but it connects in a way that Hugo Grotius doesn't, right? And so maybe some of us connect to the European tradition, some of us connect to another tradition, and I think that it's helpful in that way. Does that answer the question?
I think so.
Okay.
Is there a terrestrial example of the sort of adaptation that you envision? Is there something that has happened on land that can guide what we might do in the water or on the water?
Well, it depends on what you call terrestrial. I'll say that I mentioned the wetlands in Louisiana, all right, which people live on and used to build on and raise livestock on, so I'm going to call that terrestrial. We have the largest contiguous coastal wetlands in North America, right in the backyard of Louisiana, all right? And we're losing, we've lost 2,000 square miles of that land since the Industrial Revolution. Mainly, well, there are a lot of reasons, but one very large reason is the oil and gas industry slicing and dicing it up. And then there's levees and a whole lot of other things. Most of that land is privately owned, incidentally. And so The issue then is, okay, so how do you put it back together? We started by saying, look, we cannot fix everything that's been lost. And so we had a series, we, the state, had a series of charrettes and public meetings and so on to sort of say, okay, what do people get out of that wetland? Hunting, fishing, protection from storm. And what's the most important thing? And where are the places that we could fix it? And sometimes the fixing is pumping in sand from Texas and creating new barrier islands. Sometimes it's diverting water from the levee system so that the river can flood these areas and create more sediment and build more land. Sometimes it's seeding mangroves from crop dusters above. And all of these things are ways of growing land and a habitat. And everybody in the world is watching how we do this because it's never been done before at the scale that we're talking about. And I hope that we continue to have the political will to build that. But I think that if we can show that we can rebuild a large landscape like that, then that technology and that inspiration might travel.
I know that in your work, you think about climate adaptation, resilience, class, and race.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How does class and race play into the sort of adaptation that you envision for the oceans?
Well, the important thing to understand is, just as a general thing, is that the people that are going to be most harmed by climate change and failing ecosystems as a result are people who are poor and disenfranchised in various ways. That's true in any country, and it's true of people who live along the equator. And it's particularly true of people who rely on the ocean for free protein, for instance. There are a lot of folks who live on the coast in India, Indonesia, the South Pacific, whose lives really depend, maybe not on the entire ocean, right, but they depend on these ecosystems working. The mangrove trees protecting their coast so it doesn't fall in. In the Sundarban Islands, people grow rice on the interior of the island. If that water, that salt water, pushes in and floods those fields, nothing grows for years, right? And so it's really, really important for the mangrove forests to work well. It's really important to look at sea level rise. What is really hard about it is that the way I think you fix these problems is by activating smaller individual communities. In the Sundarbans, there's actually a group of women who used to not be in the paid marketplace, who now are in a paid marketplace because they're paid to grow mangroves and plant them in this way. And it's this small sort of work that takes a lot of time to organize, but I think that it is the only way that makes it successful.
One of the solutions that we hear about is aquaculture.
Yes,
fish
right.
farming.
Yeah.
Growing fish to replace the fish that people catch in the wild. Is that a good idea? Is that a genuine solution? What do you think of it?
It's a really hard one. So I got to say something. So when Sylvia Earle in the late 1960s was here, she gave similar talks to the talks that we're giving as fellows. And one of the talks that she gave, which we have on tape, is a talk in which she actually is expressing some promise for aquaculture. She has, as far as I know, not a fan of almost any kind of aquaculture anymore. In fact, she's vegetarian. She's not a fan of eating protein from the sea if it's animal protein. I'm very wary of many kinds of aquaculture, including the very large-scale types that have been proposed, for instance, in the Gulf of Mexico, in which you literally have a net bubble under the sea of all kinds of fish that you're feeding with antibiotics and so on. I think we just don't know enough about that. And shrimp farming in Thailand and in the South Asian areas, they tear up the mangrove forest, which protects the coast, so they can have 1 or 2 years, good years, of shrimping. And so I think it's really hard. I'm not going to say that you can't have aquaculture. You can grow mussels, right? There's certain things that work where they do that in the Salish Sea, certain things that tend to work well. I think a lot of it, I'm sorry to say, I think a lot of it is just too uncertain.
You talked a lot about all the benefits that accrue from the ocean.
Yeah.
One new benefit is deep sea mining and mining the oceans for these precious metals that we want to use in things like electric vehicle batteries, that sort of thing. How are we to think about deep sea mining?
It's a really interesting issue. Most people, when I have students and we learn about these things, most of them never heard of this. But a mile, 2 miles down on the bed of the sea, there are these little nodules. They look like potatoes. They're about the size of potatoes, and inside, and they're thousands and thousands of years old. And inside of those little potatoes are cobalt and nickel and all kinds of metals that just happen to be the metals that we need for electric vehicles, right? And otherwise, to mine those terrestrially is a human rights nightmare and an environmental nightmare. And so there are many companies that are saying, oh, you don't want us to have the human rights nightmare on land, so let us go down and literally send these robotic machines down and just sort of pull up all of these little potatoes on a massive scale. And it creates, a mile or two down, it creates, I want to say it's a sandstorm, but it's probably the size of a hurricane down there in 3 dimensions of all the sediment and the disruption as a result. And there are all kinds of animals that we have not even inventoried that live down there that would probably die, right? All to get these metals out. So it's actually a very big issue, because when I was in French Polynesia, the French government, because I think of the interest in French Polynesia, they want a moratorium on any kind of deep sea bed mining. The Cook Islands that are nearby, they want to license their area for companies to come in and make money to be able to do that, because then they can have more money. So I think right now, under international law, we don't have an answer. There's an international body connected with the UN that is considering a moratorium on deep sea mining, which I'm in favor of. And I'm also in favor of prohibiting or limiting as much as possible deep sea mining within jurisdictional waters, in part because we don't have a system where you can get the reparations if something goes wrong. So what do we do about the batteries? I think maybe it's a good news story and we're getting a little lucky, but as it turns out, there are different kinds of minerals that can replace, that we can build batteries without using as much cobalt or nickel. And in fact, Google and Apple, 2 companies that rely heavily on those things, and Tesla, have all said they're in favor of a moratorium on deep sea bed mining. I think Volvo has said that even if there is deep sea mining, they won't use batteries that use that. And so I think we're going to have it. I think it's going to be really contentious. And I think it's going to turn into one of these things we're trying to figure out where the source of these things comes from, and I think that's going to make it a really difficult issue.
An important element of your talk was individual action.
Yes.
You had us all breathe so that we could appreciate the value of the ocean, and you ended your talk by encouraging us to stay engaged. Can you tell us a little bit more about what, as individuals, we might be able to do?
Sure. I mean, some things, I work on a college campus, we're on a college campus, and the fascination with plastics is amazing on college campuses, right? So certain things that consumers can do, right? They can say, well, I'm not going to ask for straws at the Starbucks, or I'm not going to buy water that comes in plastic bottles. Those are all good things. I'm not against those. I mean, I think that's all really good. But there's a limit to what people can do as consumers, or should be expected to do, I think, also as consumers. But once you get interested in something, let's say like plastic, then you can start going to meetings and thinking about how you actually might be able to change policies. Maybe you can change a policy at your university so that they don't sell water in plastic bottles at all. Or maybe you change a policy within your municipality in which they charge for plastic bags, these sorts of things. Maybe you're raising awareness. When I talked to Cara Norman, she's still one of my favorite people I interviewed of all the work that I've done. She was 14 years old when I interviewed her, and she's doing peer-reviewed research on corals. And she didn't get interested in it because of science. She got interested in it because she liked the beauty of the ocean and these kinds of things. And I said, well, are you a political person? And she says, no, I'm not political at all. And so we got into a conversation. She says, well, I got to go. I said, well, where are you going? She's going, oh, well, I'm going to this town hall meeting that's against more cruise ships coming into Key West, where she lives. And I said, that's political. She says, no, it's just science. It's not a good idea. And I just love that. There are all kinds of ways to get involved in things, even if you're landlocked in Las Vegas like I am or was. I think you have to keep an interest in it. And one thing I'll just say about the coral restoration, because even among scientists, there's some question about whether you can do this at scale, to save all the coral. No, you can't do it at scale and save all the coral. What you might be able to do is save pockets. And the other thing that you might be able to do is get a whole generation of younger people involved in understanding more about the ocean. And that's going to stay with them for the rest of their lives. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so in favor of it.
Let me ask you a last question about your journey. And you've dedicated your career to thinking about issues of climate adaptation and resilience. How has your work on oceans changed your perspective on these issues?
Well, I first got interested in this after Hurricane Katrina. I moved to Loyola 9 months before the storm. And after we got through all of that, I said, I'm devoting my career to climate resilience, and I have. And now I am thinking an awful lot about communication. I'm really interested in writing books for popular audiences because it's too urgent. We have to talk to people. And the hard part about the ocean that I'm grappling with is that most people in the world, by far, have never been in the high seas. Most people have never been in a kelp forest. Most people have never been snorkeling, right? Which is different from people who might have seen a forest or might have seen livestock somewhere or petted an animal, right? So how do you make that real? When I was interviewing my research partners, I asked that question in the very beginning. How can you make something real that people have never seen or don't know that they depend on? That's a big challenge, and that is forcing me to think more about metaphors and about what maybe the limits of empathy are, right? So that's what oceans are teaching me.
Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you for a great talk and a thought-provoking discussion. I also want to thank the audience for your questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find information about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to Rob Verchick.
Thanks very much.